Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. Thanks for being here for this time of Bible study. In this Sunday morning class, we've been looking at selected Psalms. We're looking at some of the Psalms, and the one that we're going to review this morning is Psalm 18. So turn to Psalm 18, and that's the one that we'll be gaining wisdom from this morning. This is a longer one, so we're not going to read the whole thing. We'll just work our way through it as we go. This psalm is almost verbatim identical to 2 Samuel 22. It's almost word for word the same. 2 Samuel 22 records the same thoughts of David. Now this is kind of interesting contextually. And remember, we've been saying that many of these Psalms have with it a handed down tradition as to what was motivating David's writing of this Psalm. Those traditions are not inspired, so we wouldn't hang our hats on that. But there seems to be a reasonable degree of legitimacy in thinking that these Psalms had this background or this purpose or motivation. In this case, it seems that David's now ascended to the throne. You know, for all the last several weeks, we've been talking about David writing the Psalms as he was being pursued. King Saul was trying to kill him. And we know that history. And in recent weeks, all of the Psalms that we've been reviewing were apparently written in that time frame when he was under hot persecution, when he was really being sought after, when his enemies were really trying to kill him. This psalm now seems to be after that. This seems to be that's past. David has ascended to the throne. King Saul, of course, was killed in battle. So his prime enemy, his arch enemy, is gone now, and David is in a period of prosperity. He's ascended to the throne. Things are well. So that seems to be the gist of it. But again, I think it's very interesting that this psalm is a near identical repeat of 2 Samuel chapter 22, which records the same thoughts and words of David. Okay, so let's start out. Psalm 18, verse 1. I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. All right. So again, we think that David here is expressing his thanks and his gratitude to God for all the previous Psalms that we studied. He was asking for this kind of deliverance. He was seeking God's help, and we talked several weeks there in a row. This was a very critical time in David's life. He could have easily been killed by Saul. Saul had an army of men pursuing him. He had informants and others who were trying to bring David down. And so those Psalms we studied in recent weeks were written during that time where he was under a real strain, a real stress, under real trial. Now that's over, it seems, and he's writing, but we see him acknowledging God, praising God for what he has done, and also expressing his ongoing dependence upon God. So I think all of that is worth noting here. I think maybe something for us to learn from this is, how often do we, in a deep moment of trial, when things are really looking bad and we're not doing well, either physically or spiritually, how often do we get real busy praying? You even hear somebody say, man, I was praying like I never prayed before. In the moment of trial, we resort to the panic button. We almost use prayer like a panic button. And we do that, and then when the trial is passed, we forget about it. We just go on. I think what's notable here about David is he didn't do that. If we are right that David is writing this after the trial has passed, after he has now ascended to the throne, after King Saul is dead and his pursuers are no longer pursuing him, he doesn't forget that God was his strength and his deliverer. And I think that's a great lesson for us to learn. I know I've been guilty of that, praying about a matter, and then when it seems like it's resolved or better, forgetting to express gratitude and thanks and praise to God for his help. So if we didn't gain anything else from this psalm than that, I think that would be a worthy lesson. Tom?
God anointed David early on, and then he went through all these trials. David knew that God had anointed him to be king. He knew Saul was God's initial chosen there, so he didn't do anything like that. And here he had all these tests that he faced up to that before he became king. And so, he stood back and sort of like he's looking back on things, he says, God really did protect me through all those trials and things. And he's made me a better, stronger person to rule as king in that thing, and he's giving God thanks for it. And if we look at that as, as children of God, we've come and, he's provided us with salvation. If we obey and accepted it, he's made that promise to us. That's why he wrote the book of Revelation. And so we're going through all these trials up until that time until he, puts us in, before his throne at that time. And if we can put the same perspective of David, fight through these trials, endure to the end, God fulfills his promises, and be thankful for it.
Yeah, you got to be grateful when the trial is passed. I think you're right. Our author asks, how does David describe what this peril was like that is now past? And we've talked in recent weeks, it was really bad. Look at verse 4. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. So, his issues were, what was going on was literally life-threatening. Now, we won't ask for a show of hands, but I think if we ask two questions. One, have you been through any troubles in your life? And I think every one of us would raise our hands, right? We've had troubles, we've had trials and issues. So we would all raise our hand to that question. What if I said, now, has anybody experienced life-threatening issues from the trials that you faced? And I think very few. Somebody might, if you've been through a physical illness that was life-threatening. But most of us have not been through the kind of peril, certainly not like David, who was being pursued and persecuted. None of us could raise our hand and say, man, my persecutors were so strong and they were after me so harshly that I felt my life was in danger. None of us have been there. So, this was how bad it was for David. Skip down to also verse 16. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. Verse 18, somebody's reading a newer version. The King James says, they prevented me in the day of my calamity. What's a newer version say there?
Confronted.
They confronted. Okay, they confronted. So, again, he's talking about how bad it was. I always when the idea he drew me out of many waters. One of the most terrifying things to me is the thought of being in water without maybe shipwrecked or in some way thrown into the water and struggling to survive, trying to keep from drowning. And that's sort of the imagery that David used. Actually, that's how bad it was for him. And I also think it's significant that he said, they were too strong for me. David there is acknowledging that he would not have been able to make it on his own. They were too strong for me. A lot of times we think we can just, push our way through on our own strength and determination. Sometimes it's just not possible. Sometimes the enemy is too strong. And David felt that his enemies that he was facing were too strong. And so he's really grateful that God helped him because he couldn't have made it on his own. All right? Notice how God, he pictures how God looked at this situation. Read there beginning in verse 6. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even unto his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and they came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and did fly, yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion around about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the sky. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of water were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord. At the blast of the breath of thy nostrils, he sent from above. He took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy. All right. Now, this is obviously highly figurative language, right? When you talk about smoke coming out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth, so much so that coals were kindled by the fire that came from. This is highly imaginative, figurative, symbolic language. But the key to it is right there at the end of verse 7, because he was wroth. God was angry. Now, what was the situation that made him angry? David was an innocent man, right? David was, in this particular matter of King Saul pursuing him, David was innocent of any wrong. In fact, I would argue that David went the extra mile in trying to resolve his issues with Saul. He had never made any attempt to undermine Saul. In fact, when there were, as we've talked in recent weeks, when there were a couple of occasions where he could have killed Saul, he did not. He said he wouldn't raise his hand against God's anointed. And so I would say that David went above and beyond what would be expected of such a person. He would not take vengeance upon Saul. But that whole circumstance made God angry. Here's a righteous man who's being unjustly persecuted. How does God view that? God is angry when that happens. It made God angry. He was wroth. He was angry. So I think there's a real general application. God is angry. Last week in the psalm it said God is angry with the wicked every day. God is in a big general fashion, God is angry about sin. When sinners sin, it makes God angry. But in particular, and that's the particular sense of this text is that God is particularly angry when righteous people are persecuted and mistreated. So God knows. If we're living right, if we're trying to do right, God knows. And if others do badly or treat us wrong, God observes that and it makes him mad. When righteous people are mistreated, it makes God mad. God is always angry at sin. But here's a particular sense in which God is angry when righteous people are mistreated. Thoughts or comments, anybody? All right, you all off quiet this morning. All right. So he referred to him in verse 6 there. He says, in my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even into his ears. What about this, that God heard my voice out of his temple? See any issue there?
Well, the temple hadn't been built.
Solomon's temple hadn't been built yet, right? So what's this temple?
I think it's God's realm.
God's realm, God's dwelling place, where God is, right? So this is just an acknowledgement of the fact that David's prayers were heard by God in heaven, right? I'm always sort of awestruck by the idea that we have that privilege too. That when we're living for God and faithfully serving Him, we have the privilege of approaching Him in His heavenly temple, even coming before His very throne. Hebrews 4 verse 16 says, let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Do you ever dwell on that? Do you ever dwell on the idea that God has invited us to come before His very throne in heaven? And when I read that, then I try to think of some of those descriptions in the book of Revelation about the throne scene. There's God on His magnificent throne. The 24 elders are gathered round. The 4 beasts are there. The heavenly host of angels is all there. And I'm allowed to go there? I'm not worthy to be there. That's just too much to imagine. Why would I be invited into that realm? But I am. As a child of God, I'm invited to come before His very throne. That's incredible. That's amazing. David sensed that. And I think we should have a proper view of that. Sometimes I think we get maybe too nonchalant in our approach to God by way of prayer. Don't forget where you are. Don't forget the spiritual scene that you're engaged in. You are before the throne of God. He hears you from His heavenly temple, from His dwelling place in heaven. God hears and is aware of us. We're just not worthy of that. We're so absolutely unworthy of that, and yet it's still true. David sensed that, and we need to sense that as well. Thoughts or comments here? James?
Back to the book of Esther, and when she was asked to go before the king, she was hesitant, right? Because kings don't accept everybody. Earthly kings. They have this, well, because they're in fear of their life, probably a lot, but they just don't want to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
But if we think he's just a human, a very corrupt human too, probably, but we think the contrast between that and the pure and almighty God that would allow us to come anytime before Him, and we should that show us how grateful we should be.
Exactly right. I like that example that James mentioned about. And we just recently in our daily Bible readings, we read the book of Esther. So you remember, there was this horrible plot. Wicked Haman had this plot to annihilate the Jews. And Mordecai found out about it. And so he sent word to Esther, go before the king and ask for deliverance of the people, of the Jews. And Esther, who was the queen, her initial reaction to that is, I can't go. I haven't been called. It's been 30 days since the king has called me into his presence. And the rule was, if you showed up in the king's presence having not been called or invited, unless he extended the scepter to you, which he might or might not, you would be killed on the spot. And that would apply even to the queen. She felt like if he doesn't want to see me and I show up there, it could cost me my life. And you remember Mordecai responded, well, maybe you came to the kingdom for such a time as this. Maybe this is why you're in the position that you're in. But that is a real insight into how earthly kings acted and act. I suppose that's still true in certain realms. Not with God. There's an open door invitation. Come whenever you will. God wants you to come before His throne. That is really incredible. And David sensed that. All right. Our author asks us, what is the character of a man that God rescues from trouble? So let's keep reading there at verse 20. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanliness of my hands hath he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and I did not put away his statutes from me. I was also upright before him, and I kept myself from mine iniquity. Therefore hath the Lord recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his eyesight. With the merciful thou wilt show thyself merciful, with an upright man thou wilt show thyself upright. With the pure thou wilt show thyself pure, and with the froward thou wilt show thyself froward. For thou wilt save the afflicted people, but will bring down high looks. You think David's bragging there? There at the start of that reading in particular, he seems to say, I've really been doing good, man. I've got clean hands. I've practiced righteousness. I have not wickedly departed from my God. Would you take it that David is boasting here, or expressing a proud attitude? Tom?
Acknowledging the attributes of God, what God expects from people. And he's going through and looking at sort of that retrospective. Here, you just had that, picture of God as this angry individual of his enemies. And then he's contrasting it to, David going through and keeping his laws and looking at, recognizing God as God, and I need to be doing these things. And I'm grateful to God that he did that, and that he's grateful, and in doing so, I can have the assurance that God is going to have his approval of it.
I think that's right. I would not. We think these are inspired words, and so I would not argue that David is proudly boasting of his own performance, but I think he is saying, like Tom said, that David understands that God, there's a conditionality upon which God blesses us and answers our prayers, and that conditionality is that we're striving to live righteously. Now, we're not perfect in that exercise by any means, but we got to be striving to that goal. Those who are not striving to live for God don't have the privilege of approaching his throne. And so I think David here is simply saying that God is such a God. As Tom said, the previous verses described him as a very angry God. He's angry at the wicked. This is expressing how God views the righteous who are trying to serve him faithfully, okay? So I think that's the distinction there. I don't think he's bragging about his own personal righteousness. We know that even in that whole episode where Saul was pursuing David, David wasn't faultless in that matter. Do you remember when he went to the place where the tabernacle was, and he ate the forbidden showbread, and he lied in the process of doing that? David wasn't perfect in this matter. His general manner was that he was trying to do the will of God, but he wasn't perfect. And so I think that's the takeaway for us. God hears our prayers. God invites us into his throne room. We should be trying absolutely to do the best that we can. We will fail from time to time. And even when we fail, we have the privilege of asking for his forgiveness. But the general principle is God is angry with the wicked, God blesses the righteous. And I think that's what David is saying here. That's the contrast.
David put forth the effort to do right. And if you do that, God will help you. In that same way as us today. If we put forth our effort, God will be with us.
I think you're right. Anybody else? All right. So the question is asked, unto whom does God ascribe unto whom does David ascribe his success in all his conflicts? Verse 29, for by thee I have run through a troop, and by my God have I leaped over a wall. Those, again, I think those are intentionally exaggerated statements. I have run through a troop. However, you remember on those occasions when he was right in Saul's immediate presence and could have struck him dead, he went, especially that time when Saul was asleep in the camp, he went through a troop of soldiers to get to Saul and was spared. So almost a literal sense, I have run through a troop, and by my God I have leaped over a wall. But again, he's crediting God with that success, not his own power or might. Look at verse 32. It is God that girdeth me with strength and maketh my way perfect. He maketh my feet like hinds' feet and setteth me upon my high places. He teacheth my hands to war, so that a bow of steel is broken by mine arms. Thou hast also given me the shield of thy salvation in the right hand, and thy right hand hath holden me up, and thy gentleness hath made me great. Thou hast enlarged my steps under me, that my feet did not slip. I have pursued mine enemies and overtaken them, neither did I turn again till they were consumed. I have wounded them that they were not able to rise. They are fallen under my feet. For thou hast girded me with strength unto the battle. Thou hast subdued under me those that rose up against me. Thou hast also given me the necks of mine enemies, that I might destroy them that hate me. They cried, but there was none to save them, even unto the Lord, but he answered them not. Then did I beat them small as the dust before the wind. I did cast them out as the dirt in the streets. I think it's significant there that how many times he said that God did this. Notice there it starts out, it is God that girdeth me. He, verse 33, he maketh me. Verse 34, he teacheth me. Verse 35, thou hast. Verse 36, thou hast. You see him crediting God with the success that he experienced. You know, when you stop to think about it, David was against overwhelming odds. Wouldn't you agree with that? I mean, King Saul, he was the powerful king. He had an army of people doing his bidding. Others, David, we know there were occasions when David, people were hesitant to even help David because they feared Saul. So I would argue that David was facing overwhelming odds against him, and yet he succeeded. And he saw and believed that it was because God had done it, that it was not by his own might or power that this success had been achieved. He credited God with that. Again, I think that's really notable in regards to David and his mindset. You know, in the scriptures, David is called a man after God's own heart. And surely a part of that is this humility which he possessed. You know, at this point now, the enemies are gone. He has ascended to the throne. It would be easy for a proud man to say, look at me. Look at what I have done. Think of all the things I have accomplished. And he didn't do that. That's pretty impressive. Tom?
It's interesting to look at the picture that David had of God. It wasn't like the people around him that had these concepts of these gods. Well, this God is this God over this thing, and this is God over that thing, and, you know, over the earth, over the...
So the pagans, yeah.
Yeah. When David describes God, he covers the whole gamut. He covers, you know, even that, talking about the anger, he talks about being able to make the mountains shake and still the rivers, and, you know, calm the streams and all this other things that go through, and then he goes through the all-knowing about God, that he knew about these things, and he was able to deliver in these times of adversity and things. Sometimes I think we have that concept, we sort of shrink God's power down to things that we sort of put in our realm right around about us. We don't think of his magnificence and his power and his ultimate control of everything.
Yeah,
And
so
David had
he
this
did not divide it up into different deities who did this or that. He credited God with all of it. One God over all. That's certainly true. Absolutely true. So again, we should, if David was so dependent upon God and understood it to be so, then we ought to understand our dependence upon God and be willing to express that and praise Him for His help. Notice verse 43. Thou hast delivered me from the strivings of the people, and thou hast made me the head of the heathen. A people whom I have not known shall serve me. As soon as they hear of me, they shall obey me. The strangers shall submit themselves unto me. I think David here is talking about now he's ascended to the throne, and the kingdom that he rules over is what he's describing in that. Look in 1 Kings 4. Now this is talking about, 1 Kings 4 is talking about Solomon, but it's basically talking about the kingdom that Solomon inherited from David. So Saul has just recently ascended to the throne at the death of David. And notice how large his kingdom was. This is what David passed down to Solomon. 1 Kings 4, verse 21. Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour and 80 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 oxen out of the pasture, and 100 sheep beside hart and roebucks, and fallow deer and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tiphsah even to Azah, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. So that's the kingdom. Solomon didn't accomplish that. That's the kingdom that he inherited from David. And so when David describes his kingdom here in Psalm 18, he's not exaggerating. And he had rule. He had rule over the heathen and people that he didn't even know came to serve him. They obeyed him. As soon as they heard of him, they obeyed him. Strangers submitted to him. And so those are not exaggerated words. Those are words of truth concerning the kingdom of David. There's some question here as to whether this expression in Psalm 18 might have had some messianic implications in it. You know, when we say messianic, what we mean is a prophetic prediction about Jesus. And I don't know whether I would say that it definitely does or not, but it certainly could be true. David was talking literally about his physical kingdom, but there may be a spiritual application to the kingdom of Christ there. I'll let you decide what you think about it. I'm not sure. I couldn't prove that if I wanted to, but it may be the case that when he describes his kingdom and the extent of his kingdom and the power of his reign, that he may have been talking messianically. All right. He says in verse 43, let's see, in verse 48, well, let's keep reading there. Verse 45, the strangers shall fade away and be afraid out of their close places. The Lord liveth, and blessed be my rock. Let the God of my salvation be exalted. We sing that, don't we? We sing that, don't we, Wade? So, you know, there's a lot of expressions in the book of Psalms that we sing in our Psalms. I would argue, though I've never even stopped to analyze it, I would argue that there are probably more expressions from the Psalms and from the book of Revelation than probably any of the other books of the Bible, expressions that we find in our Psalms. But you know, we sing, let the God of my, blessed be my rock, let the God of my salvation be exalted. We sing that, right? Remember where it comes from. It comes right here, Psalm 18. Verse 47, it is God that avengeth me and subdueth the people under me. He delivereth me from mine enemies. Yea, thou hast lifted me up above those that rise up against me. Thou hast delivered me from the violent man. Thou hast delivered me from the violent man. I think that could be a general, he's generally praising God, and he's crediting God with everything, good thing that has happened to him. So that might be just a general expression. You've delivered me from the violent man. But I would wonder if he also wouldn't even specifically be suggesting King Saul there. Who was the violent man? Well, it could be a general expression, but I think in David's case particularly, the violent man who was trying to cause him so much grief was King Saul. You have delivered me from that violent man. When we talk about the life of King Saul, he started out pretty good, and it ended up just as corrupt and wicked as he could possibly be, and suffered a horrible, humiliating defeat, and he and Jonathan were killed in that battle, and their bodies mutilated. The fall of King Saul, pretty incredible. And that may be exactly who David is talking about there, that he was delivered from the violent man. Any thoughts or comments? Anybody? All right. This psalm is quoted in the New Testament. Anybody know where that is? If you have a center reference Bible, it might tell you. The verse that's quoted in the New Testament is verse 49. Therefore will I give thanks unto thee, O God, among the heathen, and sing praises unto thy name. That's quoted in Romans 15, verse 9. Let's go over there. Romans 15, verse 9. We might start at verse 8. Now, I say that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers, and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, for this cause I will confess to thee among the Gentiles, and sing unto thy name. There he quotes Psalm 18, verse 49. Now, there's several other quotes. The next quote, Paul engages in a series of quotes from Old Testament. The next quote is from Deuteronomy 32:43. The next one is from Psalm 117, verse 1. And the last one, verse 12, is from Isaiah 11, verse 40. Can't read my writing. Verse 46 or verse 16. Isaiah 11, 46, I believe that is. So, I think it's significant that the Old Testament is very often quoted in the New Testament. Sometimes you hear people kind of griping that we spend any time studying our Old Testaments at all. It's so important, so necessary. And, I think the significance of it is seen in the fact that the New Testament inspired writers often quoted from Old Testament sources, and this is one of them. And then finally, the last couple of verses of this psalm, verse 49, therefore will I give thanks unto thee, O God, among the heathen, and sing praises unto thy name. Great deliverance giveth he to his king, and showeth mercy to his anointed, to David, and to his seed forever. So, this is I think not surprising that the psalm started back there, verses 1 through 3, acknowledging all of God's goodness and praising him. And the psalm ends, again, acknowledging God's greatness and praising him. Great deliverance, verse 50, great deliverance giveth he to his king. Right? That's David, to his king and to his anointed. David was anointed to be king. He even says, to David. So, great deliverance hath he given to his king, and showeth mercy to his anointed, to David. All right? And to his seed forevermore. Oh, that would have to be a reference to the Messiah, right? To Jesus, who was a direct descendant from David. And so again, David is mentioning something here about God's showing his favor toward his seed, to the anointed seed. Not just to David immediately. David was the immediately anointed king, but there's a seed. And so David is writing here approximately 1,000 years before Jesus would be born. And by inspiration here, he drops a hint of the Messiah. Thoughts or comments, anybody? All right, so I think our takeaways from this psalm, and we're just all but out of time. I think our takeaways from this psalm are, after you get what you needed from God, don't forget him. David needed God's help through all the troubles that he was having with King Saul. After you get your help, don't forget to remember God and thank him for what he has done for you. That's definitely clear here. And I also think the picture of God being angry with the wicked but looking with favor upon the righteous is something that's a great comfort. And the fact that God hears from his throne in heaven is amazing. Any final thoughts? All right, thanks everybody. Lord willing, next week we'll try to tackle Psalm 60. Will be the one that we try to undertake next week, Lord willing. Thanks everybody.